Chapter 30, Part 2 of Social Statics by Herbert Spencer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Social statics, or the conditions essential to human happiness specified, and the first of them developed, by Herbert Spencer. General Considerations, Part 2, 8. That it cannot last longer than needful may be readily proved. In a way equally simple and perfect, it is made to decline as fast as it can be done without. The very feeling during whose minority it exercises regency over men becomes the destroyer of its power. Between the temporary ruler and the ultimate rightful one there is an unceasing conflict, in which the wane of influence on the one side is necessitated by its growth on the other. For, as already shown, the sense of rights, by whose sympathetic excitement men are led to behave justly towards each other, is the same sense of rights by which they are prompted to assert their own claims, their own liberty of action, their own freedom to exercise their faculties, and to resist every encroachment. This impulse brooks no restraint, save that imposed by fellow feeling, and disputes all assumption of extra privilege by whomsoever made. Consequently, it is in perpetual antagonism with a sentiment which delights in subserviency. Reverence this authority, suggests power worship. Why should I? Who set it over me? Demands instinct of freedom. Obey, whispers the one. Rebel, mutters the other. I will do what your highness bids, says the one with bated breath. Pray, sir, shouts the other, who are you that you should dictate to me? This man is divinely appointed to rule over us, and we ought therefore to submit, argues the one. I tell you no, replies the other. We have divinely endorsed claims to freedom, and it is our duty to maintain them. And thus the controversy goes on, conduct during each phase of civilization being determined by the relative strengths of the two feelings. Whilst yet too feeble to be operative as a social restraint, moral sense, by its scarcely heard protest, does not hinder a predominant hero worship from giving possibility to the most stringent despotism. Gradually, as it grows strong enough to deter men from the grosser trespasses upon each other, does it also grow strong enough to struggle successfully against that excess of coercion no longer required. And when it shall finally have attained sufficient power to give men by its reflex function so perfect a regard for each other's rights as to make government needless, then will it also, by its direct function, give men so wakeful a jealousy of their own rights as to make government impossible. A further example, this, of the admirable simplicity of nature. The same sentiment which fits us for freedom itself makes us free. Of course, the institutions of any given age exhibit the compromise made by these contending moral forces at the signing of their last truce. Between the state of unlimited government arising from supremacy of the one feeling and the state of no government arising from supremacy of the other lie intermediate forms of social organization, beginning with despotism tempered by assassination, and ending with that highest development of the representative system under which the right of constituents to instruct their delegates is fully admitted. A system which, by making the nation at large a deliberative body and reducing the legislative assembly to an executive, carries self-government to the fullest extent compatible with the existence of a ruling power. Of necessity, the mixed constitutions that characterize this transition period are in the abstract absurd. The two feelings answering to the popular and monarchical elements, being antagonistic, give utterance to antagonistic ideas, and to suppose that these can be consistently united is to suppose that yes and no can be reconciled. The monarchical theory is that the people are in duty bound to submit themselves with all humility to a certain individual, ought to be loyal to him, ought to give allegiance to him, that is, ought to subordinate their wills to his will. Contrariwise, the democratic theory, either as specifically defined or as embodied in our own Constitution under the form of a power to withhold supplies and in the legal fiction that the citizen assents to the laws he has to obey, is that the people ought not to be subject to the will of one, but should fulfill their own wills. Now these are flat contradictions which no reasoning can harmonize. If a king may rightfully claim obedience, then should that obedience be entire? Else there starts up the unanswerable question, why must we obey in this and not in that? But if men should mainly rule themselves, then should they rule themselves altogether? Otherwise, it may be asked, why are they their own masters in such and such cases and not in the rest? Nevertheless, though these mixed governments, combining as they do two mutually destructive hypotheses, are utterly irrational in principle, they must of necessity exist, so long as they are in harmony with the mixed constitution of the partially adapted man. And it seems that the radical incongruity pervading them cannot be recognized by men, whilst there exists a corresponding incongruity in their own natures. A good illustration of the law, that opinion is ultimately determined by the feelings and not by the intellect. 9. How completely, indeed, conceptions of right and wrong in these matters depend upon the balance of impulses existing in men may be worth considering a moment. And first, observe that no tracing out of actions to their final good or bad consequences is by itself capable of generating approbation or reprobation of those actions. Could it do this, men's moral codes would be high or low, according as they made these analyses, well or ill, that is, according to their intellectual acuteness. Whence it would follow that in all ages and nations, men of equal intelligence should have like ethical theories, whilst contemporaries should have unlike ones, if their reflective powers are unlike. But facts do not answer to these inferences. On the contrary, they point to the law above specified. Both history and daily experience prove to us that men's ideas of rectitude correspond to the sentiments and instincts predominating in them. We constantly read of tyrants defending their claims to unlimited sway as being divinely authorized. The rights of rival princes were of old asserted by their respective partisans, and are still asserted by modern legitimists with the same warmth that the most ardent democrat asserts the rights of man. To those living in the feudal times, so unquestionable seemed the duty of serfs to obey their lords, that Luther, no doubt acting conscientiously, urged the barons to vengeance on the rebellious peasants, calling on all who could to stab them, cut them down, and dash their brains out as if they were mad dogs. Moreover, we shall find that absence of the ethical sentiment completely disables the mind from realizing the abstract title of the human being to freedom. Thus, with all his high reasoning powers, Plato could conceive of nothing better for his ideal republic than a system of class despotism. And indeed, up to his time, and long after it, there seems to have existed no man who saw anything wrong in slavery. It is narrated of Colonel D'Oyley, the first governor of Jamaica, that within a few days after having issued an order for the distribution to the army of 1,701 Bibles, he signed another order for the payment of the sum of £20 sterling out of the impost money to pay for 15 dogs brought by John Hoy for the hunting of the negroes. The holding of slaves by ministers of religion in America is a parallel fact. We read that the Chinese cannot understand why European women are treated with respect, and that they attribute the circumstance to the exercise of demoniacal arts by them over the men. Here and there amongst ourselves, analogous phenomena may be detected. For example, Dr. Moberly of Winchester College has written a book to defend fagging, which he says, as a system of school government, gives more security of essential, deep-seated goodness than any other which can be devised. Again, in a recent pamphlet signed a country parson, it is maintained that you must convert the Chartist spirit as you would reform the drunkard spirit by showing that it is a rebellion against the laws of God. But the strangest peculiarity exhibited by those deficient in sense of rights, or rather that which looks the strangest to us, is their inability to recognize their own claims. We are told, for instance, by Lieutenant Bernard, that in the Portuguese settlements on the African coast, the free negroes are taunted by the slaves as having no white man to look after them, and see them righted when oppressed. And it is said that in America the slaves themselves look down upon the free blacks and call them rubbish. Which anomalous-looking facts are, however, easily conceivable when we remember that here in England, in this 19th century, most women defend that state of servitude in which they are held by men. To account by any current hypothesis for the numberless disagreements in men's ideas of right and wrong, here briefly exemplified, seems scarcely possible. But on the theory that opinion is a resultant of moral forces, whose equilibrium varies with every race and epoch, that is, with every phase of adaptation, the rationale is self-evident. Nor indeed, considering the matter closely, does it appear that society could ever hold together were not opinion thus dependent upon the balance of feelings. For were it otherwise, races yet needing coercive government might reason their way to the conclusion that coercive government was bad, as readily as more advanced races. The Russians might see despotism to be wrong and free institutions to be right as clearly as we do, and did they see this, social dissolution would ensue, for it is not conceivable that they would any longer remain contented under that stringent rule needed to keep them in the social state. 10. The process by which a change of political arrangements is effected when the incongruity between them and the popular character becomes sufficient must be itself in keeping with that character, and must be violent or peaceful accordingly. There are not a few who exclaim against all revolutions wrought out by force of arms, forgetting that the quality of a revolution, like that of an institution, is determined by the natures of those who make it. Moral suasion is very admirable, good for us, good indeed for all who can be induced to use it. But to suppose that in the earlier stages of social growth moral suasion can be employed, or if employed would answer, is to overlook the conditions. Stating the case mechanically, we may say that as in proportion to their unfitness for associated life, the framework within which men are restrained must be strong, so must the efforts required to break up that framework, when it is no longer fit, be convulsive. The existence of a government which does not bend to the popular will, a despotic government, presupposes several circumstances which make any change, but a violent one, impossible. First, for coercive rule to have been practicable implies in the people a predominance of that awe of power ever indicative of still lingering savageness. Moreover, with a large amount of power worship present, disaffection can take place only when the cumulative evils of misgovernment have generated great exasperation. Add to which that, as abundance of the sentiment upholding external rule involves lack of the sentiments producing internal rule, no such check to excesses as that afforded by a due regard for the lives and claims of others can be operative. And where there are comparatively active destructive propensities, extreme anger, and deficient self-restraint, violence is inevitable. Peaceful revolutions occur under quite different circumstances. They become possible only when society, no longer consisting of members so antagonistic, begins to cohere from its own internal organization, and needs not be kept together by unyielding external restraints, and when by consequence the force required to effect change is less. They become possible only when men, having acquired greater adaptation to the social state, will neither inflict on each other nor submit to such extreme oppressions, and when therefore the causes of popular indignation are diminished. They become possible only when character has grown more sympathetic, and when, as a result of this, the tendency towards angry retaliation is partially neutralized. Indeed, the very idea that reforms may and ought to be effected peacefully implies a large endowment of the moral sense. Without this, such an idea cannot even be conceived, much less carried out. With this, it may be both. Hence, we must look upon social convulsions as upon other natural phenomena which work themselves out in a certain inevitable, unalterable way. We may lament the bloodshed, may wish it had been avoided, but it is folly to suppose that, the popular character remaining the same, things could have been managed differently. If such and such events had not occurred, say you, the result would have been otherwise. If this or that man had lived, he would have prevented the catastrophe. Do not be thus deceived. These changes are brought about by a power far above individual wills. Men who seem the prime movers are merely the tools with which it works, and were they absent it would quickly find others. Incongruity between character and institutions is the disturbing force, and a revolution is the act of restoring equilibrium. Accidental circumstances modify the process, but do not perceptibly alter the effect. They precipitate, they retard, they intensify or ameliorate. But let a few years elapse, and the same end is arrived at, no matter what the special events passed through. That these violent overturnings of early institutions fail to do what their originators hope, and that they finally result in the setting up of institutions not much better than those superseded, is very true. But it is not the less true that the modifications they effect can be effected in no other way. Non-adaptation necessitates a bad mode of making changes, as well as a bad political organization. Not only must the habitual rule it calls for be severe, but even small ameliorations of this cannot be obtained without much suffering. Conversely, the same causes which render a better social state possible render the successive modifications of it easier. These occur under less pressure, with smaller disturbance, and more frequently, until by a gradual diminution in the amounts and intervals of change, the process merges into one of uninterrupted growth. 11. There is another form under which civilization can be generalized. We may consider it as a progress towards that constitution of man and society required for the complete manifestation of everyone's individuality. To be that which he naturally is, to do just what he would spontaneously do, is essential to the full happiness of each, and therefore to the greatest happiness of all. Hence, in virtue of the law of adaptation, our advance must be towards a state in which this entire satisfaction of every desire, or perfect fulfillment of individual life, becomes possible. In the beginning it is impossible. If uncontrolled, the impulses of the aboriginal man produce anarchy. Either his individuality must be curbed, or society must dissolve. With ourselves, though restraint is still needful, the private will of the citizen, not being so destructive of order, has more play. And further progress must be towards increased sacredness of personal claims, and a subordination of whatever limits them. There are plenty of facts illustrating the doctrine that under primitive governments the repression of individuality is greatest, and that it becomes less as we advance. Referring to the people of Egypt, Assyria, China, and Hindustan as contrasted with those of Greece, Mr. Grote says, "The religious and political sanctions, sometimes combined and sometimes separate, determine for every one his mode of life, his creed, his duties, and his place in society, without leaving any scope for the will or reason of the individual himself. The ownership of people by rulers, from its pure form under Darius, through its various modifications down to the time of l'État c'est moi, and as even still typified amongst ourselves in the expression 'my subjects,' must be considered as a greater or less merging of many individualities into one. The parallel relationships of slaves or serfs to their master and of the family to its head have implied the same thing. In short, all despotisms, whether political or religious, whether of sex, of caste, or of custom, may be generalized as limitations of individuality, which it is in the nature of civilization to remove. Of course, in advancing from the one extreme in which the state is everything and the individual nothing, to the other extreme in which the individual is everything and the state nothing, society must pass through many intermediate phases. Aristocracy and democracy are not, as they have been called, separate and conflicting principles, but they and their various mixtures with each other and with monarchy mark the stages in this progress towards complete individuality. Nor is it only by amelioration of governmental forms that the growth of private claims, as opposed to public ones, is shown. It is shown, too, by the alteration in voluntary unions, in political parties, for instance, the manifest tendency of which is towards dissolution, by internal divisions, by diminution of power over their members, by increasing heterogeneity of opinion, that is, by the spread of a personal independence fatal to them. Still better do the changes in religious organizations illustrate this law. That multiplication of sects which has been going on in these latter times with increasing rapidity, and which is now so abundantly exemplified by the severing of the establishment into evangelical, high church, and Puseyite, again by the Free Church secession, again by the schism of the Methodists, again by Unitarian differences, again by the splitting off of numberless local congregations not to be classed, and again by the preaching that identity of opinion should not be the bond of union, the universal tendency to separate thus exhibited is simply one of the ways in which a growing assertion of individuality comes out. Ultimately, by continual subdivision, what we call sects will disappear, and in place of that artificial uniformity obtained by stamping men after an authorized pattern, there will arise one of nature's uniformities, a general similarity, with infinitesimal differences. 12. From the point of view now arrived at, we may discern how what is termed in our artificial classification of truth, morality, is essentially one with physical truth, is in fact a species of transcendental physiology. That condition of things dictated by the law of equal freedom, that condition in which the individuality of each may be unfolded without limit, save the like individualities of others, that condition towards which, as we have just seen, mankind are progressing, is a condition towards which the whole creation tends. Already it has been incidentally pointed out that only by entire fulfilment of the moral law can life become complete. And now we shall find that all life, whatever may be defined as a quality, of which aptitude to fulfil this law is the highest manifestation. A theory of life developed by Coleridge has prepared the way for this generalization. By life, says he, I everywhere mean the true idea of life, or that most general form under which life manifests itself to us, which includes all other forms. This I have stated to be the tendency to individuation, and the degrees of intensities of life to consist in the progressive realizations of this tendency. To make this definition intelligible, a few of the facts sought to be expressed by it must be specified, facts exemplifying the contrast between low and high types of structure, and low and high degrees of vitality. Restricting our illustrations to the animal kingdom, and beginning where the vital attributes are most obscure, we find, for instance, in the genus Porifera, creatures consisting of nothing but amorphous semi-fluid jelly, supported upon horny fibers, sponge. This jelly possesses no sensitiveness, has no organs, absorbs nutriment from the water which permeates its mass, and if cut in pieces lives on in each part as before. So that this gelatinous film, as it has been called, shows little more individuality than a formless lump of inanimate matter, for like that it possesses no distinction of parts, and like that also has no greater completeness than the pieces it is divided into. In the compound polyps, which stand next, and with which Coleridge commences, the progress towards individuality is manifest, for there is now distinction of parts. To the originally uniform gelatinous mass, with canals running through it, we have superadded in the Alcyonidae a number of digestive sacs, with accompanying mouths and tentacles. Here is evidently a partial segregation into individualities, a progress towards separateness. There is still complete community of nutrition, whilst each polyp has a certain independent sensitiveness and contractility. From this stage onwards there appear to be several routes, one through the Corallidae, in which the polyp-bearing mass surrounds a calcareous axis, up to the Tubiporidae, in which the polyps, no longer united, inhabit separate cells seated in a common calcareous framework. But Coleridge has overlooked the remarkable mode in which these communist polyps are linked with higher individual organisms by the transitional arrangement seen in the common hydrae, or fresh water polyps of our ponds. These creatures, which are in structure similar to the separate members of the compound animal above described, multiply by gemmation, that is, by the budding out of young ones from the body of the parent. During the first period of the formation of these sprouts, they are evidently continuous with the general substance from which they arise, and even when considerably perfected and possessed of an internal cavity and tentacula, their stomachs freely communicate with that of their parent. As soon as the newly formed hydra is capable of catching prey, it begins to contribute to the support of its parent, the food which it captures passing through the aperture at its base into the body of the original polyp. At length, when the young is fully formed and ripe for independent existence, the point of union between the two becomes more and more slender, until a slight effort on the part of either is sufficient to detach them, and the process is completed. Sometimes 6 or 7 gemmi have been observed to sprout at once from the same hydra, and although the whole process is concluded in 24 hours, not unfrequently a third generation may be observed, springing from the newly formed polyps even before their separation from their parent. 18 have in this manner been seen united into one group. Now here is a creature which cannot strictly be called either simple or compound. Nominally it is an individual, practically it never is so. In the Alcyonide polyp, many individuals are permanently united together. In this genus they are temporarily united in so far as particular individuals are concerned, but otherwise permanently so, for there is always a group, though that group keeps changing its members. Indeed, may we not say that the tendency to individuation is here most visible, seeing that the hydrae are, as it were, perpetually striving to become individuals without succeeding? And may we not further say that in the gradually decreasing recurrence of this budding, and the simultaneous appearance of a higher method of reproduction by ova, which in the Bryozoa coexists with a comparatively languid gemmation, this tendency to individuation is still further manifested. After complete separateness of organisms has been arrived at, the law is still seen in successive improvements of structure. By greater individuality of parts, by greater distinctness in the nature and functions of these, are all creatures possessing high vitality distinguished from inferior ones. Those hydra just referred to, which are mere bags with tentacles round the orifice, may be turned inside out with impunity. The stomach becomes skin, and the skin stomach. Here, then, is evidently no speciality of character. The duties of stomach and skin are performed by one tissue, which is not yet individualized into two separate parts adapted to separate ends. The contrast between this state and that in which such a distinction exists will sufficiently explain what is meant by individuation of organs. How clearly this individuation of organs is traceable throughout the whole range of animal life may be seen in the successive forms which the nervous system assumes. Thus, in the Ocritta, a class comprehending all the genera above mentioned, no nervous filaments or masses have been discovered, and the neurine or nervous matter is supposed to be diffused in a molecular condition through the body. In the class next above this, the Nematoneura, we find the first step towards individuation of the nervous system. The nervous matter is distinctly aggregated into filaments. In the Homo gangliata, it is still further concentrated into a number of small equal-sized masses, ganglia. In the heterogangliata, some of these small masses are collected together into larger ones. Finally, in the vertebrata, the greater part of the nervous centers are united to form a brain. And with the rest of the body, there has simultaneously taken place just the same process of condensation into distinct systems: muscular, respiratory, nutritive, excreting, absorbent, circulatory, etc. And of these, again, into separate parts with special functions. The changes of vital manifestation associated with and consequent upon these changes of structure have the same significance: to possess a greater variety of senses, of instincts, of powers, of qualities, to be more complex in character and attributes, is to be more completely distinguishable from all other created things, or to exhibit a more marked individuality. For, manifestly, as there are some properties which all entities, organic and inorganic, have in common, namely weight, mobility, inertia, etc., and as there are additional properties which all organic entities have in common, namely powers of growth and multiplication, and as there are yet further properties which the higher organic entities have in common, namely sight, hearing, etc., then those still higher organic entities possessing characteristics not shared in by the rest, thereby differ from a larger number of entities than the rest, and differ in more points, that is, are more separate, more individual. Observe again that the greater power of self-preservation shown by beings of superior type may also be generalized under this same term, a tendency to individuation. The lower the organism, the more is it at the mercy of external circumstances. It is continually liable to be destroyed by the elements, by want of food, by enemies, and eventually is so destroyed in nearly all cases. That is, it lacks power to preserve its individuality, and loses this either by returning to the form of inorganic matter or by absorption into some other individuality. Conversely, where there is strength, sagacity, swiftness, all of them indicative of superior structure, there is corresponding ability to maintain life, to prevent the individuality from being so easily dissolved, and therefore the individuation is more complete. In man we see the highest manifestation of this tendency. By virtue of his complexity of structure, he is furthest removed from the inorganic world in which there is least individuality. Again, his intelligence and adaptability commonly enable him to maintain life to old age, to complete the cycle of his existence, that is, to fill out the limits of this individuality to the full. Again, he is self-conscious, that is, he recognizes his own individuality, and, as lately shown, even the change observable in human affairs is still towards a greater development of individuality, may still be described as a tendency to individuation. But note lastly, and note chiefly as being the fact to which the foregoing sketch is introductory, that what we call the moral law, the law of equal freedom, is the law under which individuation becomes perfect, and that ability to recognize and act up to this law is the final endowment of humanity, an endowment now in process of evolution. The increasing assertion of personal rights is an increasing demand that the external conditions needful to a complete unfolding of the individuality shall be respected. Not only is there now a consciousness of individuality and an intelligence whereby individuality may be preserved, but there is a perception that the sphere of action requisite for due development of the individuality may be claimed, and a correlative desire to claim it. And when the change at present going on is complete, when each possesses an active instinct of freedom together with an active sympathy, then will all the still existing limitations to individuality, be they governmental restraints or be they the aggressions of men on one another, cease. Then none will be hindered from duly unfolding their natures, for whilst everyone maintains his own claims, he will respect the like claims of others. Then there will no longer be legislative restrictions and legislative burdens. For by the same process these will have become both needless and impossible. Then, for the first time in the history of the world, will there exist beings whose individualities can be expanded to the full in all directions. And thus, as before said, in the ultimate man, perfect morality, perfect individuation, and perfect life will be simultaneously realized. End of Chapter 30, Part 2. Considerations 8 through 12.